On a Wednesday in the summer of 2002, the people of Hershey, Pennsylvania found out from a securities filing that their town's company had been put up for auction. Nobody had asked them. Nobody had to. The document said that the trust which controlled the Hershey Company had decided to diversify its holdings and wanted the company to explore a sale of the entire business. The trust in question is not a bank, and it is not a family office. It is a boarding school for poor children 3 miles from the factory, founded by a man who had no heirs and gave the school everything he owned. Today, that school's trust holds 54,612,012 shares of Hershey Class B stock. Each of those shares cast 10 votes. The result, in the company's own words, is that the trust holds 79.0% of all the votes. 79%. A school for disadvantaged children controls a Fortune 500 company, and in 2002, the people running that school tried to sell it. That is where this file starts, because everything about Hershey, Pennsylvania is stranger than the version you have heard. A candy man built a town before he had a market for the candy. He gave the whole company away in secret and let people find out 5 years later. His workers occupied his factory, and 3,000 of his neighbors came with baseball bats and threw them out. His chocolate went to war in a bar engineered to taste barely better than a boiled potato. And 100 years after he signed a deed, the institution he built to protect the town became the thing the town had to be protected from. Right now, if you search for any of this, you will be told that Hershey never advertised until 1970, that nobody in Hershey was ever laid off during the Depression, that Milton Hershey survived the Titanic, and that Hershey's chocolate tastes the way it does because the company adds a chemical to it on purpose. We pulled the documents behind every one of those claims. Most of them do not survive. This is the relocation file, the rise and fall of America's most perfect company town, what was actually built, what was actually lost, and what is still standing there today, selling 3 million tickets a year. Every number on screen carries its source, printed beside it, in the moment it is spoken. Where a figure is an estimate, it says so, and the town gets its defense. For any of it, there was a man who could not make a business work. Milton Snavely Hershey was born on the 13th of September, 1857, on a farm in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, in the same country lanes where the town would later stand. He had 4 years of formal schooling. He was apprenticed to a confectioner in Lancaster, and at 18 he opened his own candy shop in Philadelphia. It failed after 6 years. He went west to Denver, where he learned the one thing that would matter later, that caramel made with fresh milk was better than caramel made without it. Then he tried New York. That failed too. He came home to Lancaster in his late 20s, having lost 2 businesses, borrowed from relatives who had stopped lending, and hauled his equipment around in a cart. The 3rd attempt worked. The Lancaster Caramel Company, built on the milk lesson from Denver, grew into one of the largest confectionery operations in the country. And in 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he stood in front of a set of German chocolate-making machines and bought the entire display. He had them shipped back to Lancaster and installed in the caramel plant. He told a cousin that caramels were a fad and chocolate was permanent. On the 10th of August, 1900, he sold the Lancaster Caramel Company to a rival, the American Caramel Company, for $1 million in cash. He handed over the factory, the machinery, the inventory, the formulas, and the trademark. He kept one thing, the chocolate business. He was 43 years old, he had $1 million, and he had just sold the only business he had ever succeeded at in order to gamble on a product almost no American could afford to eat regularly. Then he did something stranger. He went home to the cornfields. On the 2nd of March, 1903, Milton Hershey broke ground for a chocolate factory in the middle of farmland outside a crossroads called Dairy Church. There was no rail terminal built for it, no workforce living there, and no proof that ordinary Americans would buy milk chocolate in the quantities the plant was designed to produce. There was one thing there, and it was the whole plan. Dairy farms. Milk chocolate needs fresh milk. Fresh milk does not travel, so the factory had to stand where the cows were. What he built around it is the part people forget. The factory opened in 1905. Before and after it came a bank, a department store, a trolley system, a public school, a park with a band shell, a zoo, an inn, a community building with a theater inside it, a golf course, and streets he named Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue, lit by lamps shaped like the product. The crossroads had been called Dairy Church since the 1700s. When the post office opened for the new settlement, the name on the door was Hershey, and the town has carried a brand name ever since, which sounds ordinary now in a country full of places named after the man who paid for them, and was not ordinary then because most of those places were named after men who owned the land rather than men who intended to live on it. He lived on it. His house was in the town. He ate in the town. He walked to the factory. For 40 years, the majority owner of the business was a man the workforce could stop in the street, and the whole system that follows was built on the assumption that this would always be true of somebody. And here is the detail that separates Hershey from every other company town in America, the one that the word model actually rests on. In Pullman, Illinois, George Pullman built a town for his railcar workers and rented them the houses. A man on strike could be evicted from his home by his employer, and in 1894 that is exactly what the machinery was for. In the coal patches of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, workers were paid in company scrip that could only be spent at the company store. Milton Hershey sold the houses. Workers in Hershey took mortgages, held deeds, and owned the properties outright. The bank was there so they could borrow, and the deeds were real deeds. A man who lost his job in Hershey did not automatically lose his house. That single decision is the reason the phrase model town ever attached itself here rather than to Pullman, and it is why this episode is not another story about a company store. The question this file asks is different and harder. What happens to a town built on one man's personal decency after the man is gone and only the institutions remain? The answer starts with a document he signed in 1909. Milton and Catherine Hershey had no children. Catherine, Kitty, had a progressive illness that was never diagnosed, and by the late 1900s, the two of them had accepted that there would be no heirs. On the 15th of November, 1909, they signed a deed of trust establishing the Hershey Industrial School, a school for orphan boys. The deed conveyed roughly 486 acres of land, together with every asset standing on it. Kitty died in 1915. Milton Hershey did not remarry. 3 years later, on the 13th of November, 1918, he transferred his ownership of the Hershey Chocolate Company to that school. Not a donation from the profits, not a foundation funded by dividends, the company itself. The factory, the stock, the machine that made the money, signed over to a boarding school for poor boys in a town of a few thousand people in central Pennsylvania. Biographers put the value of what he handed across the table that day at around $60 million in 1918 money. That figure is an estimate, and we are labeling it as one. The archives hold the transfer, not a valuation. In his own words, recorded by the archives, "I have no heirs, that is, no children. So I decided to make the orphan boys of the United States my heirs." He did not announce it. There was no press event and no plaque. He simply signed it and went back to work, and the country found out years later when a reporter asked him about his fortune, and he mentioned, more or less in passing, that he had already given it away. Understand what that document did. because everything that follows in this file is a consequence of it. It made a charity the owner of a corporation. It meant that from 1918 onward, the Hershey Chocolate Company's controlling shareholder was legally obliged to care about one thing above all others, the welfare of the children in that school. Not the share price, not the shareholders, the children. For 84 years that held. In 1930, the American economy collapsed and Milton Hershey went shopping. While other industrialists closed plants, he started what the town still calls the Great Building Campaign. He built a hotel on the hill above the town. He built a community building with a theater inside it. He built a sports arena, a stadium, and a new office for the company. He did it, he said, so that men in Hershey would have work with their hands instead of relief checks. Between 1930 and 1936, he spent more than $10 million Depression-era dollars building up the town of Hershey. Over those same 6 years, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation earned more than $37 million in profit after tax. Both of those numbers are real, and the story usually stops at the first one. Here is the second half. In the same years he was pouring concrete, the men and women inside the factory were working shorter weeks for less money. They had been used to a 60-hour week. Federal recovery rules capped them at 40. When those rules were struck down as unconstitutional, the short hours stayed, and the annual bonus, the thing many families budgeted their year around, stopped being paid. So the picture in Hershey by the middle of the 1930s is a town under permanent construction, a corporation posting the best profits in its history, and a workforce whose take-home pay had been cut and whose bonus had gone. You will hear constantly that nobody in Hershey was ever laid off during the Depression. We went looking for the document behind that, and there is not one. It is a claim that lives in company histories and in the town's memory of itself, and we are flagging it here rather than repeating it. What is documented is the building campaign, the profits, the cut hours, and the cancelled bonus. In January 1937, organizers from the Congress of Industrial Organizations rented a firehouse in Palmyra, 4 miles east, and held a meeting nobody in management was told about. Several hundred Hershey employees came to that firehouse and formed a local of the United Chocolate Workers Union. Within weeks, the local had signed up several hundred more inside the plant. Then the company laid off men who had been organizing, and on the 1st of April 1937, the union met at the firehouse again and voted to act. At 11 o'clock on the morning of the 2nd of April, 1937, the union's president, a man named Russell Bayman, known in the plant as Bull, stood outside the factory and waved a red handkerchief. 600 workers sat down inside and stopped the lines. They made 2 mistakes. They did not shut the whole plant, so men kept walking into work past them, and they made no plan at all for the milk. Hershey did not buy milk from a distant supplier. It bought it from the dairy farms in the fields around the factory on a daily cycle, because that was the entire reason the town was sited there. With the lines stopped, the milk came in anyway and had nowhere to go. 240,000 quarts of it stood on the factory floor, spoiling, belonging to farmers who were watching their year's income turn sour in a building they could not enter. On the 7th of April, more than 3,000 people gathered outside the plant. Dairy farmers, loyal employees, men brought in from the next county. They sent word to the strikers that they had until 1 o'clock to come out. Negotiations to end the sit-down were already underway inside. The crowd picked up bats, clubs, and hammers and went in anyway. They outnumbered the strikers about 4 to 1. A strike leader named Miles Sweeney was hit with a baseball bat. An organizer named John Loy lost several teeth. Men were beaten with shoes and, by several accounts, with ice picks and driven out of the building through a corridor of their own neighbors. The New York Times reported it as farmers administering the indignity, not to say the physical pain, of an old-fashioned walloping. Milton Hershey was 79 years old and watched it from his house. People who knew him said he never got over it. The National Labor Relations Board investigated and ordered an election. The chocolate workers voted by a landslide for a small loyalist organization called the Independent Chocolate Workers of Hershey over the CIO. The town had chosen the company over the union in a fistfight and then chosen it again at the ballot box. Only after years of further legal fighting did the plant unionize properly, with the American Federation of Labor's Bakery and Confectionery Union, which made Hershey one of the first American candy companies to sign with a real union at all. The strikers' counterweight is owed here, and it is this. They were not wrong about the arithmetic. $37 million of profit had been earned in 6 years, in which their hours were cut and their bonus was cancelled. What the model town could not survive was being asked out loud to explain the difference. In April of the same year as the strike, an officer from the office of the Quartermaster General walked into the Hershey factory and asked for something no confectioner had ever been asked to make. Captain Paul Logan sat down with the company's president, William Murray, and its chief chemist, Sam Hinkle, and read out a specification. He wanted a bar of about 4 ounces. It had to survive high temperatures without melting. It had to be dense in food energy, and, in the archive's own record of his words, it had to taste just a little better than a boiled potato. The last requirement was the hard one, and it was deliberate. A ration bar that tasted good would be eaten on the first day. It was meant to be eaten on the worst day. Hinkle cut the sugar, raised the chocolate liquor, and added oat flour. The result was a paste so stiff it would not pour. Every bar had to be weighed, kneaded, and pressed into its mold by hand. The first order, in June 1937, was 90,000 bars, and it took 3 weeks. By 1939, Hershey could make 100,000 a day. By the end of 1945, the lines ran on 3 floors of the plant and turned out about 24 million units a week. The archive's estimate for the war as a whole is that more than 3 billion ration units left Hershey, Pennsylvania between 1940 and 1945, and the archives labeled it an estimate, so we do too. For a stretch of the war, the chocolate bar in an American soldier's pocket anywhere on earth had been made in a town of a few thousand people in Dauphin County by a company owned by a school for orphans. Milton Hershey died on the 13th of October, 1945, at 88, 5 weeks after the surrender. He had outlived his wife by 30 years, his critics by most of a decade, and the argument about whether his town was a utopia or a very comfortable cage by exactly long enough to never have to settle it. What he left behind was not a family, it was a mechanism. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth 2 minutes because nothing after 1945 makes sense without it. The Hershey Company has 2 classes of stock. Common stock, which anyone can buy, carries 1 vote per share. Class B stock, which is held overwhelmingly by the school's trust, carries 10 votes per share. A public shareholder buying Hershey stock is buying the economics of a chocolate company and almost none of the control. The control sits permanently with a trust whose legal duty is to a school. It cannot be bought out on the open market. It cannot be raided. For most of a century, that structure has done exactly what Milton Hershey designed it to do, made the company effectively unbuyable, and therefore made the town unmovable. Under it, the company grew into something Milton Hershey would not have recognized. It bought the Reese's business in 1963. It became Hershey Foods Corporation in 1968. It went into pasta, into restaurants, into whatever the conglomerate decade suggested. And through all of it, the same trust held the same votes, and the town went on being a town where the high school, the hospital, the hotel, the arena, and the park all traced back to one estate. The arrangement had one weakness, and it was never a secret. A trustee's duty is to the beneficiary, and the beneficiary is the school, not the town and not the workforce. As long as what was good for the school and what was good for Hershey pointed the same way, nobody had to choose. In 2001, a financial advisor told the trust board that holding more than half of its endowment in a single mature confectionery stock was, by any modern standard of prudence, an unacceptable concentration of risk. That advice was correct. It was also the beginning of the worst year in the town's history. Picture a retired line supervisor in Hershey in the summer of 2002, reading the paper at his own kitchen table in a house he holds the deed to, in a town where the hospital, the high school, the arena, and the park all came out of one estate. He worked for a company owned by a school. His pension came out of that arrangement. His grandchildren swim in a pool that arrangement paid for. And what the paper tells him is that the school is selling. The trust board decided to diversify, and the only way to diversify out of Hershey stock was to sell the company. The July 2002 filing made it public. 2 bids came in. The Bowman Wrigley Jr. Company offered $89 a share, about $12.5 billion. Nestle and Cadbury Schweppes came in together at around $10.5 billion. What happened next is the part that does not appear in the business coverage. The town revolted. Employees, retirees, alumni of the school, shop owners and clergy organized against the sale of a company none of them owned a controlling share of. They marched down Chocolate Avenue. They put derail the sale in windows. School alumni argued in public that selling the company would betray the deed itself. And then the state stepped in. In August 2002, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, Mike Fisher, petitioned the Orphans Court in Dauphin County, arguing that the state stands as protector of a charitable trust and that no sale of this one should proceed without a judge's approval. In early September, Senior Judge Warren Morgan granted a preliminary injunction barring the trust from signing any sale agreement without the court's consent. On the 17th of September, 2002, the trust board voted 10-7 to end the process and reject every bid. The company was not sold. Afterwards, the Pennsylvania legislature changed the law so that any future sale of the trust's controlling stake would have to go through that same court with notice to the Attorney General. You will see that statute cited online with a wrong act number, and we are deliberately not repeating it. What matters is that the protection was made permanent. The trust chairman resigned. Most of the board that had voted to sell was replaced within a year under pressure from the legislature and the Attorney General's office. The financial advice that started it had not been wrong on its own terms. A charitable endowment with more than half its value in one mature confectionery stock is a genuinely concentrated position, and any professional trustee looking at that page would flag it. That is the uncomfortable part. Nobody in this story is a villain. A board followed prudent investor logic to a conclusion that would have ended a town, and the logic never had a field on the form for the town. Read the year plainly. A charitable trust, acting on defensible financial advice, tried to sell an American town's reason for existing. It was stopped by a state attorney general, a county judge, and several thousand people with homemade signs. The deed of 1909 did not save Hershey in 2002. Pennsylvania did. The company that survived 2002 spent the next decade proving it had learned the lesson its shareholders wanted it to learn. On the 15th of February 2007, Hershey announced what it called a global supply chain transformation. About 1,500 jobs cut, American production lines reduced by more than a third, and a new plant in Monterrey, Mexico. The program was costed at between $525 and $575 million over 3 years. Chocolate Workers Local 464, the descendant of everything that started in the Palmyra firehouse in 1937, negotiated the terms in the town it had been fighting over for 70 years. The agreement reached that March allowed up to 650 local jobs to go over 3 years. And in 2012, chocolate production stopped at 19 East Chocolate Avenue. The plant Milton Hershey opened in 1905, the building the town was laid out around. Output moved to the expanded West Hershey plant across the highway, more automated and needing fewer hands. Most of the original structure was demolished. Be precise about what that is and is not. It is not a factory closing and a town dying. The chocolate is still made in Hershey, by Hershey, a mile and a half from where it always was. What ended was the arrangement where the town's people and the town's product occupied the same building, and where the number of jobs and the number of pounds of chocolate rose and fell together. After 2012, they came apart permanently the way they have in every manufacturing town in America. Hershey was simply the last place where anyone still expected otherwise. While that was happening, the institution the deed created was having a decade of its own. In 2006, the Hershey Trust bought a failing golf club called Rendale for about $12 million. An appraisal had valued it at roughly $4.5 million. The trust then spent something like $5 million more on the clubhouse. The purchase benefited a group of local investors. It did not benefit a single child in the school, and in 2013 the school closed a course and put the land to use for student housing. The Attorney General's office investigated the trust's real estate dealings, its spending, and its board's conduct across several years. In July 2016, the two sides announced an agreement, term limits for board members, limits on compensation, hard conflict of interest, and self-dealing rules, and a documented refocus on the school's mission. The trust's defense is real and belongs on air. Its legal duty is to the school, not to the town, and by the measure that duty sets, it has done extraordinarily well. The endowment is one of the largest of its kind in the world, and the school takes roughly 2,100 children a year from low-income families and covers everything: housing, food, medical care, education, at no cost to a single family. Both things are true at once. The deed produced a school that changes children's lives, and it produced a board that bought a golf course for 2.5 times its appraisal. That is what happens when a man leaves a town to an institution instead of to people. The institution outlives everyone who remembers what it was for. In June 2016, Mondelez International, the owner of Oreo and Cadbury, offered about $23 billion for Hershey. The board rejected it unanimously and said the offer provided no basis for further discussion. Mondelez walked away that August. On the 9th of December, 2024, Mondelez came back with a preliminary approach. Hershey's shares rose more than 10% in a day on the news. The trust, which has to approve any deal, was reported to have turned it down as too low. And on the 6th of March, 2026, the record date for this year's annual meeting, the trust still held 2,066,000 common shares and 54,612,012 Class B shares, casting 79.0% of the votes. 3 times in 24 years, somebody has tried to buy this town's company. 3 times the school has said no. The deed is still working. The company those votes now control is not the one Milton Hershey handed over. Its chief executive since August 2025 is Kirk Tanner, who came from Wendy's and before that from PepsiCo's beverage business. The stated strategy is to become a snacking company. The business bought an organic popcorn maker in 2025 and has said it wants salty snacks to approach 1/5 of revenue. None of that is a scandal. It is a large public company behaving like a large public company, which is the point. The votes still belong to the school. What the school votes for is now decided by the same logic that governs every other consumer goods business on the New York Stock Exchange. So say plainly what fell because the town did not. Hershey Park drew 3 million visitors in 2024. It opened its 120th season on the 3rd of April, 2026, with a new hotel and an expanded water park. Chocolate World takes around 3 million people a year and has passed 117 million since 1973. Derry Township, which contains the town, counted 24,717 people in the 2020 census and has grown since. Anyone telling you Hershey, Pennsylvania is a dying town has not been to Hershey, Pennsylvania. It is one of the most visited places in the state. The property market is strong. The medical center is a major regional employer. And on a Saturday in July, you cannot park. What fell is the arrangement. For most of a century, Hershey was the one place in America where the company was owned by an institution that lived in the town, whose only duty was to the town's children, and which could not sell out because a dead man had written it down. That was the model, that was the thing worth the word perfect, and it was never about the chocolate or the street lights. Then the institution decided, on advice, that holding the company was imprudent. It took a state attorney general and a county judge to stop it. The next decade sent 1,500 jobs out of the supply chain, moved production across the highway into a plant that needed fewer people, and demolished the building the town was drawn around. The same institution spent $12 million on a $4.5 million golf course and had to be reformed by the state. And the company is now run, correctly and unremarkably, as a snacking business by an executive hired out of fast food. The town survived all of it. The town is fine. The idea that a company could belong to the place it was built in, that is what fell, and it fell in a courthouse in Harrisburg in September 2002 while everybody was watching the share price. And the counterweight is owed because the people who defend this place are not sentimental and they are not wrong. Hershey today has a hospital that serves half of central Pennsylvania, a school district people move into the district to get into, and a park that employs several thousand people every summer. The school that started all of it still takes children who have nothing and hands them a childhood with a roof, a doctor, 3 meals and a diploma at no cost. If the measure of a model town is what it produces for the people inside it, Hershey is still producing. The measure that failed is a different one. It is the measure of whether the arrangement holds without the man. And the honest answer from the record is that it held for 57 years after his death, cracked in 2002, and now survives on a state statute and a court supervision rather than on anybody's good intentions. That is not nothing. It is just not what he thought he was building. Now the claims against the documents. This is the most repeated fact about the company, and Hershey's own archives call it a myth in those words. What is true is that it avoided consumer mass media. What it did instead, elaborate store window displays, cooking pamphlets from about 1915, a cookbook around 1922, a 48-minute film in 1932, and 2 more shorts in 1933, and postcards printed small enough to be slipped inside the chocolate bars themselves. The archives hold those postcards with postmarks from China, Alaska, Mexico, and France. The first national newspaper advertisement ran on the 19th of July, 1970. He was never on it. He booked passage and cancelled because he needed to be home earlier than the sailing allowed, and crossed on the German liner America instead, reaching New York on the 6th of April, 1912, 9 days before the sinking. The archives hold the cancelled check, $300 to the White Star Line, dated the 18th of December 1911. First-class staterooms ran $3,000 to $4,000, so it reads as a 10% deposit. The check is on display in the town. The compound is genuinely there, and the taste is genuinely distinctive. The company says it does not add it. The chemistry points to lipolysis, the controlled breakdown of milk fat in Hershey's own milk process, rather than an added ingredient. Some other American manufacturers do add it deliberately, which is probably where the story crossed over. Verdict: real compound, unproven accusation. No document supports it as a blanket claim. Documented instead, more than $10 million spent on the town between 1930 and 1936. More than $37 million in after-tax profit over the same years, hours cut, and the annual bonus stopped. Contested by oral histories held in Hershey's own archives and by historians who have worked with them, some of whom conclude the company encouraged the crowd and leaned on dairy farmers who depended on its business. One of them puts it flatly: it is a bit of the Hershey Company's mythology that these were all independent farmers. We are not resolving it. We are telling you it is disputed, which is more than the version in your feed will do. That headline is from 2017, about 2,700 positions, most of them outside the United States. It is recirculated every year as if it were new. It did not twice. Rejected unanimously in 2016 and reported as rejected again in December 2024. The company remains independent, controlled by the school. One last thing, and it is the part that stays with me. The document that made all this possible is not complicated. It is a deed of trust from 1909 in which a man with 4 years of schooling and no children signed over 486 acres, and then 9 years later, the entire company to a school for boys who had nothing. He did not put his name on the school. He did not announce it. The archives have his sentence about it. He had no heirs, so he decided to make the orphan boys of the United States his heirs. 108 years later, that decision still casts 79% of the votes of a company worth tens of billions of dollars, and it is the only reason the town of Hershey, Pennsylvania, was not sold in 2002 to a chewing gum company from Chicago. You can call that perfect, or you can call it a very well-built cage, and the comment section below this video is going to have both, and both are arguing about a real thing. What you cannot do is call it ordinary. There is nothing else like it in America, and there is a reason for that. Nobody else ever tried it, and the one man who did had to die before anyone could find out whether it worked without him. It mostly did. That is the highest grade this file is prepared to give. Next time on the relocation file, we go to the other kind of company town, the ones where the company left and did not build anything on the way out, and where the deed, if there ever was one, protected nobody at all.